Where are the Asian or European customers to justify a new oil pipeline to Canada's west coast? I've asked this question before, and I intend to keep asking it until someone provides an answer. I'm asking again today for two reasons. One, new information from the International Energy Agency suggests there won't be enough customers. Two, a few days ago, Heather Exner-Pirot of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute wrote an opinion piece that so clearly illustrates why it needs to be asked and answered. So let's start with Exner-Pirot first. She's the Director of Energy, Natural Resources, and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. On June 26th, the Hub website published her op-ed. Quote, "No, we're not done building pipelines in Canada," end quote. She argued for new oil pipelines strictly from the supply side. That is, there are 170 billion barrels of bitumen in northern Alberta, and such a large resource will and should be extracted. The closest she came to discussing the demand side is this comment. Quote, "As for the business case, I expect that human civilization will always use hydrocarbons. We may burn less of it in the coming decades to respond to climate concerns, but the bitumen from the oil sands will still find markets." End quote. Still find markets, will it? Where's the proof for that claim? There is none. The IEA, however, pays particular attention to oil demand. Oil 2025, analysis and forecast to 2030, paints a pretty bleak picture for the hydrocarbon industry. A combination of rapidly growing sales of EVs and a slowing economy thanks to Donald Trump's tariff war slows oil consumption growth significantly between now and 2030. This year's report even moves global peak oil demand up to 2029 from 2030. There are multiple causes of peak oil, but the biggest by far is China. A combination of EV sales and fuel switching in medium and heavy-duty trucks slams the brake on demand growth, which peaks in 2026, no later than 2027. By 2030, China's oil demand is shrinking as electrification accelerates. India then becomes the biggest source of global demand growth, but its consumption is relatively small and plateaus through the 2040s. The global south grows through the 2030s, but the extra consumption isn't enough to offset decline in the wealthy economies of the global north. Aviation, freight hauling, and petrochemical consumption grows, but the electrification of transportation falls much more rapidly. As much as the IEA has a pretty good read on China's energy future, the agency has historically underestimated both its pace of electrification and the impact of exporting its electrotech to emerging markets. After 2030, the IEA's World Energy Outlook 2024 models three scenarios to 2050. STEPS, basically the status quo, sees a decline of 10 million barrels per day. In the net zero scenario, it falls to more than 80 million barrels per day. Finally, in the APS scenario, which Energy Media considers the most likely, only 57 million barrels of oil per day are needed. Oil supply, however, continues to grow. By 2030, there will be 105 million barrels per day of demand and 114 million barrels per day of production. That's a surplus of 9 million barrels. By 2050, surplus supply is closer to 20 million barrels. What we'll have in just a few years is falling demand coupled with increasing supply capacity, and that can't be good for prices. From a Canadian perspective, IEA modeling does not support building one new pipeline, let alone several, as Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has demanded. In fact, oil demand peaks even before a single new pipeline can be built and brought into service, supporting the argument that any new Canadian oil pipeline will very quickly become a stranded asset. All that being said, there are a few modeling studies that support Exner-Pirot's argument. OPEC, for example, forecasts oil demand growing by 17 million barrels per day by 2050. That could create plenty of market space for Alberta to double production to 8 million barrels per day. But once you use a modeling study to justify building a pipeline, then that study is open to criticism. In the case of OPEC, the modeling assumptions have more holes than Swiss cheese. The much better strategy to dupe the public which Exner-Poirot uses, is to ignore the math and imply that growing oil demand is self-evident. Another strategy is to ignore alternatives, like the optimization of existing pipelines such as the Trans Mountain expansion, or shipping DRUbit, D-R-U-bit, by rail. How can Canadians have a conversation about such an enormous project if there isn't a business case to support it? The IEA's forecasting to 2030 and beyond suggests that there won't be enough customers to justify building the 1 million barrels per day pipeline to the West Coast that Alberta is demanding. Why do we let boosters like Exner-Poirot get away with claims that have no basis in reality or modeling analysis? If you take nothing else from this video, remember this. Ask pipeline advocates to show you their math. Someone's math. Any math. If they can't show their math, then they can't be taken seriously. And if someone does show you their math, please forward it to the Prime Minister at markwcarney@parl.gc.ca because, frankly, I don't think he's seen the math either.